Am I amplified? Am I amplified? Can you hear me, Mother? That's right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I thought I was having the full 15 minutes, but it's only 10 minutes, so I'm going to speak more quickly. This presentation is called Become a Moodle Developer for Fun, Fame and Fortune. And this is aimed at people who are thinking about becoming Moodle developers rather than experienced Moodle developers. Because I'm going to be talking quickly, I won't tell you too much about who I am, but I'm the creator of the word, the gap fill question type, and it is being a Moodle developer that has allowed me to lead this rock star lifestyle that I do. So why would you want to become a Moodle developer? What do Moodle developers do? I think perhaps one of the number one housekeeping things people do is to keep code compatible with the latest version of Moodle. And people like myself hunger after the early bird badge to say that my plugins are up to date with the latest version. And it's not a complex job. In fact, it's a really good thing to start with. The other thing is to modify existing plugins to add new features. And then there's, of course, creating entirely new plugins. I should point out when I keep talking about plugins that an excellent golden rule is to never modify core Moodle unless you're going to commit it to HQ, and that is a golden rule: do not modify core Moodle unless a client turns up with a wheelbarrow full of money and is very insistent, of course. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about programming, that you can work independently, because you're probably going to have to, and of course that you are already familiar with Moodle. There are some reasons not to be a Moodle developer. I know that sounds very unlikely. There are limited uses of the Moodle trademark in the sense that with some free software you can spend one evening reading a few web pages and the following morning put out an advert saying, I am a WordPress expert. But because of the trademark, if people can claim that they're Moodle developers, they probably know what they're talking about. The documentation for developers is limited and dispersed, and despite my claims earlier on, you probably won't get rich or famous unless you think of fame as standing in front of an audience like this, which I do. This excites me. So, how hard is it? It's not rocket surgery or brain science. Having said that, some of the leading developers do seem to have PhD in hard sums. I'm looking at you, Tim. It's not the latest fashionable framework. Somebody recently asked about could they incorporate JRandom, Facebook, cool, and I said probably not. You don't want to do that. And the other golden rule is do it the Moodle way. In other words, look to see how other people have done it, go along to things like the Dev Jam if you possibly can, and do it the Moodle way, otherwise you may regret it at some point in the future. So, where do you get your information from? How do you keep up to date? Forums, and that really means Moodle.org forums. Telegram, you really need to get on the Telegram chat. It's now got more than 700 people using it. And of course, meetings and moots like this. Now, I am suffering this year from moot envy. This is my third moot of the year, but I didn't go to Moodle DAC. Okay? And Moodle DAC is the one that's aimed specifically at developers. So if you're thinking of becoming a developer, and I'm reliably informed that individuals can afford to go to it as well. So Moodle DAC is probably the bee's knees about that. My colleague, Guy Thomas, went along. He told me about it, yes, I envy. Okay, so what's so cool about the Moodle.org forums? It is moderated by professionals. I do some moderation on there, so we're not all professionals. You get answers from experts, people who write core code, people who actually write plugins. And there are 16 years approximately worth of searchable content, okay? Worthwhile looking at the dates when you look at the response there, just in case it happens to be for Moodle 1.9, which some people still consider to be Moodle Classic, but is a little bit out of date. Okay, how can you get answers to your questions? Golden rule of getting answers to questions generally is give them a meaningful, snappy subject. And it's probably worth illustrating what is not a meaningful, snappy subject. For example, if you say, help, urgent, I can't get people enrolled, urgent implies something pressing, such as your trousers are on fire. That's urgent. But if your trousers are on fire, asking a question in the Moodle.org forums, you're not going to get a response quickly enough before things that are important to you get singed. So don't say help, don't say urgent. You can say help, but don't say urgent. Give as much information as possible. In fact, I'd recommend giving out what you think of as too much information and say what your experience level is, because if you don't ask your question sensibly and usefully, you may get an answer that you don't want. And I've commissioned an artist to give you an idea of what can happen if you don't ask your question well. There you go. You may get a response that's a bit like an upset bear, and the bear may be closer than you think. But the reason sometimes people are slightly short in the response is because they're very busy people and they really want to help. Okay. So where can you find information? There is the developer wiki, which is a wiki that you can update. You can update it. And don't be frightened to update it. You think, well, I'm not absolutely sure, because I can promise you somebody else will come along and go, you're wrong there, we'll revert it. There are some books. The one I recommend above all others is by a chap called Thomas Muraz. And there are some videos, but that's not the primary source. Okay, what technologies will you need to learn? PHP, JavaScript, and SQL, but in my personal experience, 95% of everything I do is PHP. You'll do some JavaScript. You're not going to need very much SQL at all. Now, don't reinvent the wheel, okay? Because probably somebody's done it before, so get really adept at searching through code. Search through core code is a great place to search, but also get familiar with GitHub and all the other Gits online, because the benefit of open source is, well, the source is open, you can get at it, okay? Great artists steal, they say. But please, credit where appropriate. I love to put in lots of credits in my readmes. What other technologies do you need to get familiar with? You really, really need to get familiar with PHP Unit, which is an automated testing framework, not just because it will automatically test your code, but the fact you've created those tests means you've documented how you think it should work. Behat is amazing. It's like an invisible person clicking on your web browser. And of course, we have real humans. Tools that you will need, you do need an integrated development environment. I think you're crazy if you don't use Xdebug, and I persuaded one of my colleagues who thought I was crazy that he needed it. He now uses it. And you're going to need Git eventually. So one of the things about Git is that it's quite confusing, isn't it? It really is quite confusing. But the nice thing is, I think David Mudrak from HQ said to me at some point, you're not going to lose anything, okay? And it is essential for sharing it. You at least need to know how to type in git clone. Okay? So you really need an integrated development environment. I recently was looking at somebody's code who didn't use one, and I was reminded of the benefits. I did a bit of a Twitter poll on this. PHP Storm and MS Code is really good. PHP Storm costs some money, but not a lot of money. It's well worth spending. And MS Code, although it says Microsoft, that MS is, it is genuinely free with a proper free license. I strongly recommend it. So what about actual formal training? Moodle Bytes from New Zealand, they're cool guys, and they get people to facilitate online courses who really, really know their stuff, people like Justin Hunt. And you may not be aware of this, but there is now HQ have a really cool dev school. So, coming to wrapping up now, what about troubleshooting? What about you find a bug in your code and you can't work out what's going to happen, why it's happening? Number one tip, I sometimes forget this, switch to a core theme. Maybe your theme is causing your problem. Be aware there's a thing called the JavaScript console that'll tell you maybe throwing out errors. And I should have said this at the very start, should have been in slide one, set debug to developer. You've got to go in there, because this will throw out all manner of errors that otherwise simply won't show up. So follow the standards. Make sure your code matches the Moodle coding standards. Okay? There's a thing called Code Checker, a plugin that'll go through and you'll look at the output and you go, does that really matter? Yeah! Do it right. Get it indented properly. Don't use snake case. Do it like everybody else. Be obedient. And then there's PHP Doc Checker, which checks that you've actually got the right kind of comment. So these are the essential APIs: Forms, DB, and JavaScript. AMD, you'll have to learn about AMD. Now, there's a spelling error on this. There's a spelling error on this. The files API is complex, right? But sooner or later, you're going to have to get familiar with it. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, the main technologies are PHP and JavaScript. You really need to get on the Moodle.org forums and Telegram. Get hold of Telegram. It's a great chat program. All the cool people are there, and me, and follow the standards. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, questions and answers. Anybody want to ask me anything? How to get a rock star lifestyle?
Only one question, please. We are running out of time.
It's not really a question, but a helpful addition. PHP Storm is free if you prove you are working on an open source project. PHP Storm is free if you prove you are working on an open source project. An entry in GitHub for a Moodle plugin that's active is enough to get a free one.
Yeah. Let me comment on that. Yes, you can get a free license. I think they ask you to renew it each year or something. But even if you pay for PHP Storm, I can't remember, it's like, I don't know, it's less than £100 or something. And, you know, how important is it having the right tools? You know, you're not going to skimp on a desk and a chair, are you? But I really, really do recommend the Microsoft product. And I'm working on getting as many Moodle-specific, there's a Moodle-specific plugin for that that's really cool. And I'm putting some documentation about that. So yeah, those are the two leading tools. Obviously, you know, a lot of people with beards use VI, of course. Here's a man who uses VI. Or Vim, or GVim, if you like, you know. Bit of a sissy. Oh, sorry. When I came in earlier on, they said to me, I'm looking for my spiritual leader, and they took me straight to the presentation you were doing.
Please. Thank you. Thank you so much. Break applause. Tienes 15 minutos, más tiempo para preguntas. Ahora te quedan 5 y yo estaré así. Estaré en aquella columna.
No sé si podemos conectar. No és Fireware.
I si ho posem en aquest d'aquí?
Aquest és USB-C?
No sé què.
No, és USB, això. No. Tens tu per adaptador? Si no, el vaig a buscar.
¿Los conecto?
Ah, vale. Però això per què?
Aquest ja estava buscant aquí.
No, jo el que et deia és de connectar-ho amb un HDMI. Este. Está, hombre preparado.
Lo que pasa es que esto no le va a funcionar, ¿no?
No.
Esto no te va a ir, ¿vale? Tienes que pasar tú con el dedico. ¿Sí? Espera que se proyecte.
Perfecto.
Póntelo bien.
¿Cómo se pone?
Hola. Bueno, tienen traductores. No lo tomes.
Well, I'm going to talk about how to turn Moodle into a progressive web app. I'm going to do a little presentation. Yep, that's it. It's okay like that, no problem.
Ara, ja està.
Okay.
Es que si le doy a presentación se va.
Okay, so...
No, se va la imagen.
Okay, so what's a progressive web app? A progressive web app, basically it's a normal web app like Twitter, like Facebook, like Moodle, of course. But it has some kind of conditional checks, like if conditions, basically, that allows us to check against the browser if the browser supports some features or not. And then if the browser actually supports them, we can take advantage of those. And that's like progressive enhancement, yes, based in if conditionals that we check using JavaScript. And because of that, we can offer a better user experience, better performance, only if the browser supports it. If the browser doesn't support it anyway, we can still offer the core functionality of the app, and the user won't notice anything else that just, well, the performance won't be as good as, but it doesn't matter because he won't have the best performance anyway, so he won't know what he's losing somehow. So typical examples of progressiveness or these if conditionals are if, for example, the service worker is supported by the navigator, then you register as service worker. We will talk about this later on in a bit more deeply. Then another kind of check is, well, if the service worker is supported, does this browser support like push API? Like, can the browser listen for push notifications? And another kind, which is also very common, is if the browser supports the cache storage API, which basically allows us to communicate, to share a series of cache technologies. Is it actually pronounced cache? Cache. Sorry. So you can share this cache, these key value kind of storages, or also even request response and the response storage itself. You can share them with the service worker that we will talk about it now, and those are the examples I was talking about, and the window. What is a service worker? I consider the service worker the most important part of any progressive web app. That's my opinion. What is it? It's a JavaScript file. Probably you have seen it already, most of you. You can name it as however you wish. The important thing is that you can register it doing the conditionals I showed before, like the first one you see right there. That's actually a real code. The other one is not so real, but that one is real. The navigator service worker register. That's how you register the service worker. Then this script is run on the background by the browser. You may, if you open the development console, usually I think it's in the application tab, if I'm not mistaken. You will find there how the service worker is being registered and how it's updated if you are trying to update it and so on, how you can unregister it manually too, and so on. Basically, this code is an event-driven kind of JavaScript. Basically, it's a piece of JavaScript code that you place event listeners. Event listeners like what? Event listeners like install, which is at least, for example, at the event that the service worker has been installed itself. Another very common kind of event you would like to listen to is the fetch, which is, as you know, how the browser communicates with an external server, how it sends requests. And that way, the fetch one is the key one here. That way you can manage to implement through this service worker, this piece of JavaScript code that you add listeners and then you react to those events happening. You can implement this caching and pre-caching kind of strategies, fallback responses in case if the server is down. You can actually react to this kind of, you can adapt yourself to this kind of situation. The server is down, but then I can show you still some content that I have pre-cached before, like HTML, CSS. So you can, for example, show a nice 404 kind of error page that instead of the ugly browser default error, and so on and so forth. Then you can do also listen to push for push notifications, as I was talking before. And in general, you can do all sorts of things to improve the user experience in terms of catching and making the navigation faster. And even if you actually do it very, very well, you can, and depending on the project and so on, you can also implement an offline kind of navigation experience, even using the browser. We are talking about the browser here, right? These are some of the typical ways you would think about in terms of what should I catch, like which kind of endpoints that if this application, the Moodle, for example, usually would, for example, Ajax kind of request will actually hit some kind of endpoints in Moodle, no? Like endpoints that serve the GUI JavaScript or the minified CSS, whatever. These kind of endpoints, you could think about them and implement depending of the endpoint and depending on how static is the resource you're trying to access, you can implement one strategy of caching or another. I'm not going to go into detail, but you can more or less imagine what I'm talking about by reading that, right? Okay, so I wanted to actually show you two real experiences we had, like 1 year ago, one of them, and another one 3 months ago somehow. The first one was what we did is to try to make the Moodle itself, like the Moodle web, you know PHP, you know the Moodle itself, to try to make it into to try to make it as much as possible into a progressive web app. How we did that? We followed these two fancy named patterns, the PRPL and the app shell model. The app shell model is a kind of user interface thing. It's basically that what we did is, okay, so as you know, Moodle developers, you know for sure, Moodle uses layouts to print the code, to decide what I'm going to print to the user, right? Uses layouts, and then inside the layout there is some content, right? Like if you're in the layout inside a course, then that content may be mod kind of content that shows the view for some activity and so on. What we did was, okay, let's modify the layout, and we did an actual experiment with the mod URL, because as you know, the mod URL is the simplest mod there is there in Moodle, because it's shorter, I mean, the less lines of code, basically. So what we did is, I'm going to show you right now a little demo. We did basically that, which is we make the layout like completely empty of user data, no menu, no user menu, just the data we consider it safe to be cached, okay, because there is no personal data involved. Well, that was a proof of concept. Perhaps there was some in the HTML code we missed, okay, but it was a proof of concept. So basically we clean it and we catch that, but how do we load then the side menu? How do we load the content of the mod URL, right? What we did is to move all the code in the view PHP. We moved it, and the layout and so on in the theme. We moved it to external functions, and then we call those external functions from the view PHP, yes? And then that content that is not there, we call it through an AJAX request, actually, which was not cached, right? So what we achieved doing that is that in terms of progressive web app, we managed this was a test server we had 1 year ago, and basically the first meaningful paint, which was like the first thing you see, like the browser is reacting and you see something, we decreased the time for almost half, like it was 1 second and something, and now it was like 600 milliseconds. But the content itself, like you will see, it's right there. Yes, that's the content of the Mood URL. Actually took 1.5 seconds and a bit more. I mean, it took more or less the same amount of time to show the actual content, but the user could start seeing things much sooner, right? And that's, as people experts in user experience probably will agree with me, that that's interesting, because the user, you know, like feels like the thing is working faster, right? Even if the actual content that he really needs is loading at the same moment, no, than the original. So that's what the app shell model is. Also, you can even improve over this and do the skeleton loading screen, which is like I'm showing you some shadows where the actual content should be. And while it's loading, you see the shadows there, and then you more or less even think about where you want to go. You can start scrolling and so on, or start even clicking if you really know where is going to be the button, and you can start doing things. It's like a UI pattern, you know, like that improves user experience, right? I don't know if you are aware of these skeleton loading screens, like when you are using, I don't know, Twitter in your mobile, or the progressive web app of Twitter, not the Twitter native app, but the version they have, the light version they have. You can probably see that when you are trying to access new Twitters and they are still loading, you will see some like placeholders, right? That's basically, that's the skeleton. That's the skeleton loading screens, okay? That's just user experience improvement. We did the offline fallback thing, that the error thing I told you about before, and some with the manifest JSON, which is basically a file you put beside the index HTML if you are working, well, depends on the project, but in the root of your project, basically you can register, you add a series of JSON data, and you can, for example, make the app to be able to be like what's called a home screen. Basically, it behaves like an icon of a native app, right? But it's just, that's actually not the Moodle app, not the Moodle mobile app, that's the Moodle web, okay? That just with a manifest JSON, right? And then you can register it on your device, mobile device, desktop. I don't know how to say in a better way, less confusing way. Anyway, you can do the same with as a Chrome app. That's actually not the Moodle mobile app, it's the Moodle web, right? And the splash screen also is the splash screen from the Moodle web, is not the Moodle mobile app, right? That's just with the manifest JSON and some icons, and then you can pre-catch these icons and so on, and this may work even offline, right? That's one of the ways to make it. Of course, this way has the main difficulty, the main challenge, and the main problem, which is a big problem, that in order to implement this in general in Moodle, you will have to refactor every single entry point, every single view PHP, every single index PHP. You will have to refactor in terms of showing the content after an Ajax request. That's not going to happen. So anytime soon, I think. So another option was to implement an Angular progressive web app. And what's going on here? How can we do it? Should we write an app from the scratch? No, actually, there is already an Angular app written in Moodle, as you know. It's the Moodle mobile app. As you know, it's an hybrid app. It's an Angular Ionic kind of app. And actually, it can run pretty much out of the box on a browser, okay? So, it's not perfect, okay? But you can make it run with 3 or 4 commands, 3 or 4 modifications, not so hard. And out of the box, you have the app shell. Out of the box, you have offline navigation, because the app, as you know, use the web SQL kind of storage, which basically stores all information that considers useful for offline navigation once received from the server. And all these things are already there. You just need to make it run on a browser, and it's not so hard. Actually, we did some proof of concept. And what we did, instead of refactoring a layout, as we did in the first experiment 1 year ago, some months ago, what we did basically is, okay, let's just extend the layout of the mobile app, run it on a browser, and extend the layout in a way that it looks more like a web. No, this looks more like the real, well, it's a proof of concept, okay, don't be so hard on me. But as you can see, we did a top navbar, the usual kind of thing, a side menu, usual kind of, that's very similar to the actual web view. What we did also is to test the offline navigation. It was working out of the box. As here, you may not see it, but this is the typical, it's a view from the developer tools, and it's offline. Okay, it's like the connection is closed. And that's an actual navigation from courses list to an activity that we have visited before, and it was already cached, okay? So, and another of the main advantages, you know exactly where are the static resources. It's not like the Moodle web that you know, well, this GUI may come from this entry point, and this jQuery stuff may come from that other entry point, and then you have to do a lot of experiments and a lot of how this can be catched without making any mistakes and errors. These are actual resources of most of the Ionic apps, right? So you know where they are, the main Ionic stuff, the minified code, and so on, so forth. You can actually pre-catch it, and then this is not done. I mean, this is something you will have to do in terms of making this work on a browser, because this app is thought to be used in devices, right? And then the devices already have these resources in the device itself, in the file system, right? So there is no need to serve it from a cache or anything like that, right? So this is the way you make it, by serving it from a web server to any browser, right? You have to get the same amount of performance somehow as in a native device running this hybrid app. You will have to do something like this. And also you could, since this is an Ionic app, you could find many guides like this one, for example, of how to implement the listeners for the push notifications in the service worker, some services to register to allow for the notifications to be used in your browser and so on. The main difficulties, again, this was the other option. These are the main difficulties of this second option. Basically, is how to differentiate the browser from the web view of Cordoba running in a device, in an Android iOS device. Is not so hard. That's not the hardest of those difficulties. The first load is relatively slow. I'm not sure why. I didn't have much time to get into that, but I suppose there are many modules loading at the same time, and perhaps some lazy loading would be better, but perhaps the mobile people, the experts in mobile, will know better how to improve that. The Web SQL, this is a big problem. This is one of the big ones, because Firefox doesn't support Web SQL. It has never supported. Nowadays, browsers are starting to deprecate it, so it's not supported anymore by anything. But Firefox has never supported. That means that 20% of the users will have problems with the caching system of the app, as it is right now, and if you try to make it to serve it to any kind of browser. And there is no routing system, probably because the native, as a mobile app running in a device, since you won't type any URLs, probably it wasn't needed. And another one of the big problems is that there is no admin views. Okay, so you can access all the functionality of Moodle as a user, but there is no functionality as an admin. Still, this could be another interesting approach of how to make Moodle an Angular progressive web app. You don't need any, unless you're an admin or a teacher and so on, you wouldn't need anything else. Just this UI served from this index HTML basically, with this static resource served from any server, and that's it. Well, thanks to my colleagues that have helped me investigating all this stuff. And that's basically it. Any questions?
Hello. In regards to the technicalities and the difficulties in your slide number 5 or 6, I can't read it from here. One of the things I think Bas from Moodle will agree on storage of the browser, which means it's blocking. So performance-wise, even if you're implementing this through whatever strategy you like, there will be a lag always. One of the other points also for the routing, I think for those routings, you need to scan through those pages to be able to catch them. You can build those routings. You don't have to rely on Angular routing system because it doesn't exist really. One point was for the database to local storage to decide on which one. I think local storage is famous enough to pick whichever most suitable one also. I actually worked on this in 2016. I was first working on these systems, and where I work, our exams are fully on progressive web apps, and we have a strategy of online first. If they fall apart, they go forward. So basically, we load those pages before exams and navigation through the local storage, and we encrypt the data, etc. So even if the browser crashes or the device crashes, we come back into this. But there are much harder difficulties, like in exam setup, say, for example, we don't expect the header response is always 206, and you can never get the video, the whole content outside immediately. You have to get it through partial content. And if it is from some other place, as per design, actually, service workers, because it might be content from YouTube, You're actually technically downloading it to local storage. This thing also in Moodle is a problem because unless it's a true plugin file, if you have any other video, you'll end up technically with almost a page that's empty, only with the text in it. I really don't, like if you share any experience apart from just loading the text content in front of you, because the interactivity about Moodle is about interactivity, you know? So if it's just only text, I can download Moodle in PDF file and read it, you know? If there is any, I don't know if you're able to share any of those workarounds you ever worked on, we really appreciate that.
Yeah, we can talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.